Hello everyone and welcome to week 9 of Poll 101 American Government. This week we're discussing the role of religion in American politics. While the assigned reading from the course textbook this week just focuses on the transformation of political parties throughout American history, I wanted this lecture to reflect one of the most recent massive transformations in American political parties, and that's the increasing role of religion in American politics. And that's the main thing that I want to tackle in today's lecture, understanding why and how religion has become so intertwined with contemporary American politics. This week, you also have a required documentary to watch based on Thomas Frank's best-selling book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Now, if you have the time, I highly recommend that you read this book, but for context, what Frank is interested in exploring in this book, What's the Matter with Kansas, is why poor voters in rural Kansas, and eventually poor voters throughout the entire country, began increasingly identifying with the Republican Party. So throughout these lectures, we've discussed how historically the Republican Party has been the party that represents wealthy interests, and while the Democratic Party has represented interests of the working class. So this documentary really tries to explain what happened here. Why are poor white Americans voting against their own economic interests? And as the book and the documentary reveal, a lot of this change has to do with religious values and how the Republican Party has been able to successfully mobilize Christian conservatives. So be sure to jot down your thoughts and your reactions to the film. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your impressions of this documentary in this week's discussion boards. And speaking of the discussion board, before we begin, let's start with a stop and think. And before we get into the lecture, I want you to think about these prompts. How and why does religion influence voter behavior and political movements today? Is this relationship problematic or beneficial to our democracy? Second, what role does religion play in shaping the laws that govern our lives? Is this problematic or beneficial to our democracy? And then finally, in order for our democracy to thrive, is there room for politics and religion to intersect? Or must they be fully separated? And if you think they must be fully separated, how do we do that? So go ahead and pause the video, reflect on these prompts, and when you're ready to proceed, hit play. Now, just to illustrate how rapidly things have changed and to understand how deeply religion has permeated our politics, I want to start this lecture by talking about a highly controversial political issue: evolution. That's right, evolution. Back in 2008, when we're getting ready for the Republican presidential primary, about 2/3 of candidates supported teaching evolution in our schools. Fast forward 4 years later, the 2012 Republican presidential primary, about 1/3 of candidates supported teaching evolution in schools. And by the time we get to 2016, only one candidate supported the idea of teaching evolution in schools, but believed that it should also be taught alongside intelligent design. And that one candidate was Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida. So for Bush, when asked about whether he supported teaching evolution in schools, he stated, "Yeah, but I don't think evolution should actually be part of the curriculum, to be honest with you. And people have different points of view, and they can be discussed at school, but it does not need to be in the curriculum. Ideally," Bush argued, "students should be presented with varying viewpoints." And by the time we get to the 2020 Republican presidential primary debates, the party has essentially reached a consensus on this topic, and it isn't even mentioned in the debates. And all of this is evident through the Republican Party's ability to fully capitalize on the evangelical vote. So back in 2000, George W. Bush won the presidency with a little more than 60% of the evangelical vote. And by 2020, we see that Donald Trump secured over 80% of the evangelical vote, marking a dramatic shift in the party's base. And now, just for clarification, let's talk about the difference between evangelicals and mainline Protestants. So for evangelicals, we can kind of conceptualize them on these various points here. They're biblical literalists, right? They believe that the Bible is the actual word of God. They believe in salvation through Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. You must be converted or born-again Christian, and there's a heavy emphasis on the need to proselytize or to convert other individuals to your religion. That's not necessarily the case with mainline Protestants who are biblical interpretivists. They believe in alternative routes to salvation, through good deeds or things like that, not solely through accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. They believe in spiritual transformation more so than conversion, and that means that there's less of a emphasis on the need to proselytize. What all of this means is that evangelicals are much more socially and politically conservative than their mainline Protestant counterparts. And as we can see from this chart here, there are clear partisan differences when it comes to that religious affiliation. So while evangelical Protestants are much more likely to identify with the Republican Party, the religiously unaffiliated are much more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. And it's this simple demographic division that further exacerbates the notion that voters who belong to parties different than us, they represent fundamental existential threats to our way of life, where you have some Republican voters perceive the Democrats as a group of godless heathens who want to destroy America, and then you have some Democrats who perceive the Republican Party as a group of Christian warriors who want to destroy this country, right? We can disagree and compromise on policy, but we're much less willing to compromise when it comes to our core values, particularly those are derived from our religious affiliation. So what explains this relationship between evangelical voters and the Republican Party? In this next part of the lecture, we'll discuss how and why evangelicals became so mobilized in American politics and how they grew to transform the Republican Party, a transformation that historians and political scientists refer to as the Great Right Turn. So beginning in the 1960s, the Democratic Party becomes enamored with the youth cultural revolution and political activism that's taking place across college campuses. So here we're talking about protesting the Vietnam War or getting engaged with the civil rights movement. Democrats no longer saw the value of courting the working class or the FDR era social policy. The Republican Party for decades was the party of the wealthy elite. So Democrats thought to themselves, working class Americans would never, ever vote for Republicans. So let's try to expand our base. And let's try to get some of these college-educated, politically active students involved with the Democratic Party. And thanks to these FDR-era policies, more people than ever before were attending college. And this produced an enormous social ripple effect that began dividing America into two social classes, the educated and the uneducated. And so by the 1980s, sociologists and historians like Paul Fussell began documenting the rise of a new social class of Americans, which he called X people. So for Fussell, X people were young, highly educated, extremely affluent, above mainstream fads. They created their own trends, right? They bought the best wine and they went to the fanciest restaurants. They were the creatives, the artists, the intellectuals, a new class of elites that were interestingly, surprisingly politically liberal, because up until this time, if you had money, if you had wealth, if you had status, it was in your best interest to vote with the Republican Party. But these individuals were unique. They were uniquely politically liberal. In 2002, Richard Florida wrote how the creative class grew to dominate American political and social culture. The hyper-educated, politically liberal creative class espoused the ideals of diversity, equality, justice, and tolerance. They moved to metropolitan cities and with them brought a new way of thinking, lessons on political correctness and the right way to think about life, society, and politics. And, today we know this class by many names. We might call them yuppies or hipsters or even woke radical leftists. They're all basically the same thing. They grew to dominate culture, media, film, tech, education with their focus on intersectionality and political correctness. And what I want to emphasize is that this entire identity is saturated with privilege and affluence. It is a completely unrelatable paradigm for the average working class American. So, the X people, the creative class, yuppies, hipsters, woke leftists, whatever you want to call them, in their pursuit of this high-class city life, they generated an enormous impact on the geopolitical composition of the United States. Consider this. The 50 largest metropolitan areas in the world house only 7% of the world's population, but generate 40% of global wealth. Just 6 metropolitan areas, San Francisco, New York City, Boston, DC, San Diego, and London, attract about 50% of all high-tech capital investment in the world. What this means is that metropolitan areas blossom while rural areas languish. And thus we end up with two classes of people in our society, liberals who live in metropolitan areas and conservatives who live in rural areas that are essentially operating in different universes. And this is one of the reasons why political polarization is so extreme and why we've lost the ability to talk to each other and understand and empathize with one another, depending on where we live, where we grow up, and where we come from. The final nail in the coffin that drove working class voters out of the Democratic Party was NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which was designed to open free trade between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Now, what's interesting about NAFTA is that it was actually an idea spearheaded by Republicans, notably by President Ronald Reagan and his predecessor Bush Sr. But it wouldn't be until Democrat President Bill Clinton took office that NAFTA would finally be signed into law. And again, the purpose was to encourage economic activity between U.S., Mexico, and Canada with reduced or eliminated tariffs. But in reality, many manufacturing jobs left the U.S. to pursue cheaper labor in Mexico, which led to monumental job losses in the United States. And so by the time we get to the early 2000s, the Democratic Party was unrecognizable from its earlier populist progressive agenda. Instead of protecting and promoting the needs of the working class, it had become the party of the highly educated, affluent Americans in the knowledge economy, which we refer to as, intellectuals, doctors, professors, engineers, big tech. It became the party of socially liberal ideologies that center on cosmopolitanism and identity. It became the party of the metropolises. And it became the party that advocated for trade policies that outsource American jobs. Now, happening alongside this, all simultaneously, we have evangelical Christians who are growing increasingly frustrated with American politics. And most of this animosity was directed towards the Supreme Court, which had banned school prayer, banned the 10 Commandments from courthouses and classrooms, desegregated communities and schools, implemented forced busing, and granted women the right to an abortion, which was the huge one that really got evangelicals really involved in politics. During this time, religious leaders had begun establishing segregation academies in the late 1960s to educate white children only. These leaders encouraged their congregations to vote for more religious politicians. And after Roe versus Wade, Paul Weyrich, an American religious conservative activist, called upon his bloc of voters, which would come to be known as the moral majority, to become more active in politics and restore the moral fabric of our country. And so after 1964, when all of this is happening, the Republican Party recognizes that Southern Democrats who are hostile to desegregation policies are drifting from the Democratic Party, and they see an opportunity. In 1968, Nixon appeals to working class Southerners by emphasizing how Democrats are destroying the education system through desegregation. Democrats only care about the minority vote through the civil rights movement, their emphasis on the civil rights movement, and white Southerners who are working class are not a priority to Democrats. So if we look at the 1964 electoral map, we see overwhelmingly Americans voting for the Democrat, Johnson, but we see this shift beginning to happen in the Deep South, where for the first time ever, the Republican Party is winning in the Deep South. And by the time we get to 1972, we've seen a utter and complete transformation, how Nixon had transformed rural America's relationship with the Republican Party. In 1980, Reagan begins building upon Nixon's strategy by emphasizing the need to return to a form of governance that prioritized states' rights over a more powerful federal government. He co-opted a lot of religious messaging, so he would often use the biblical imagery comparing America as a city on a hill. He frequently called for a spiritual revival in the United States, emphasized America as a Christian nation, as well as working class values, right? Things like family, tradition. And perhaps most significantly, Reagan changes his stance on abortion in light of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade, which enraged the conservative Christians that Reagan was trying so hard to mobilize in the 1980 election. And, a lot of this rhetoric is not merely a relic of the past. We saw similar messaging strategies throughout the Bush administration, particularly when it came to how he talked about the war in the Middle East and the war on terror. President Bush often framed this conflict as American Christianity versus Islamic radicalism, which was defined as a new kind of evil, and that we as Americans needed to wage a crusade against radical Islam. We can look at the Trump presidency and the Make America Great Again rhetoric. And oftentimes Trump discusses how the moral fabric in America is deteriorating, or that Christianity is under siege and fading. There's a reason for that. We look at the data, we can see that the percentage of Americans who are unaffiliated when it comes to their religious identity has been increasing over the years, right? So Christianity is under siege. And another frequent messaging tactic that you hear from Trump is that America is now a country in decline. So much as Christianity is in decline, so is America in and of itself, because there's this type of messaging, this type of rhetoric that Christianity and America, that these are not mutually exclusive characteristics of our identity. And so what I want to end on here with our final thoughts, the increased role of religion, particularly evangelical Christianity in American politics, it has significant implications for both policymaking and the broader political landscape. So evangelicals, with their emphasis on moral and social issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and religious freedom, have become a powerful voting bloc, especially within the Republican Party. And this has led to a polarization of political discourse where issues tied to personal faith and morality dominate the national debate, often at the expense of compromise or consensus building. So the intertwining of religious values with political identity also raises concerns about the separation of church and state, influencing not only legislative priorities, but also judicial appointments, education, and public policy on issues ranging from healthcare to climate change, not to mention the constitutional implications of the excessive entanglement of religion and politics that represents clear violations of the Establishment Clause, which we talked about, back in the beginning of the semester. Also, not to mention the concerns this creates for the representativeness of our democracy, and whether the intensifying role of religion in our politics has prioritized the rights, values, and opinions of some Americans above others. So ultimately, this shift intensifies cultural divides and reshapes the role of religion in the public sphere. And if we want our politics to move away from the divisiveness and away from the anger and away from the volatility, then we as Americans need to seriously reassess the role that government should play in enforcing our moral convictions. Well, everyone, that's all I have for you in today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.